Policy Forum. IWIL is a wonderful organization, you know that, and I know that, having hosted this event since 2012, when, as I call her, Professor Netsch, sat right here and discussed issues of the day then that were relevant then and are still very relevant today. I want to talk a little bit about Dawn Clark Netsch. And I know that many in the room had a very special relationship with her in her very many walks of life, whether it was as the state comptroller, as a member of the Illinois Senate, as a member of the Illinois delegation to the Constitutional Convention back in 1970, as the creator, as I like to say, of home rule. She actually drafted the home rule clause of the Illinois Constitution in the form that it exists today, and it is a model home rule clause for states throughout the country. She graduated Northwestern Law School as #1 in her class and as the only woman in her class in 1952. And beginning in 1965, she became the first female member of the Northwestern Law faculty and was there until she passed away in 2013. Back in 1981, she was my law professor. As some of you know, including my clients on the Highland Park City Council, a mayor and councilman, Mayor Rotering and Councilman Noble, I practice in the municipal law field. I represent municipalities throughout the state. No one has influenced my life and my career more than Dawn Clark Netsch. I took her state and local government course back in 1981. And in 2010, she invited me to co-teach that same course with her. I now, upon her death, am teaching the course that she taught me. And every year, I begin the state and local government course at Northwestern Law School by asking the students if they know or have heard of Dawn Clark Netsch. Unfortunately, the number gets less and less each year. So, I dedicate the first day of the course to Dawn Clark Netsch and everything that she was about. And the book that she wrote that we are using as our textbook, and the influence that she continues to have to this day on municipal law, on state law, on constitutional law throughout the country. She was a remarkable woman, and it is in her memory and honor that we have and host this wonderful event. And again, I am delighted to do this, and I'm delighted to see so many of you back year after year. I will tell you that this will be the last year that I host this event, at this location. We are moving our law firm offices to the building at 150 Riverside. It'll be a little less convenient for Senator Durbin to drop by, as he does, because the federal building's right across the street. But I suspect that he will still make it to the events. But look forward to this event again next year at our new offices at 150 Riverside. So when I do teach my course, one of the ways that I allow the students to have a memory of the remarkable woman that was Dawn Clark Netsch is by showing them a montage that was put together by BPI shortly after Professor Netsch passed away. It's a wonderful, wonderful montage that I'm going to show for you today. And we thank BPI for allowing us to use this year after year. It is a wonderful tribute. So please watch the screens. Let's hope this.
That's what you are. Unforgettable. Oh, near or far. Like a song.
I don't think I ever thought of myself as a woman and therefore handicapped. I really was sort of unself-conscious about, sticking out like a sore thumb. So often when I've made speeches about what qualities are really necessary, and that's there are really only two qualities that count: stamina and patience.
That's why, darling.
There's only one candidate for governor who's shooting straight with us. Dawn Clark Netsch. Colin Burris says he won't tell us how he'll fund our schools until after he's elected. But Dawn Clark Netsch is calling it like she sees it. She's got a real plan to restore honesty to our budget and bring the reforms and solid funding our schools need. Dawn Clark Netsch for governor, a straight shooter with real solutions.
I'll tell you that was in one take.
Do something, then it's up to me to go do it. And nobody's going to stop me just because I'm a female.
Dawn Clark Netsch, 3 memories. First, back when Bill and Walter were doing their old first 6 o'clock news in that newsroom set, Jim Thompson was the governor and he was sitting being interviewed about the state's fiscal condition, just as Dawn entered the studio to sit on the opposite side. Jim Thompson looked up at her and said, "Ah, my old law school professor." Without missing a beat, Dawn said, "Yes, the student who learned nothing." If not that. She invoked for me Harry Meets Sally, that famous scene in The Delicatessen, because I called her one day and I said, "This new idea of a constitutional convention, are you up for it another time? Do you think it's a good idea this time?" And she said, again without missing a beat, "No," and gave me about 20 reasons why. I ended up writing a column saying, "Dawn Clark Netsch, I'll have what she's had." And finally, this memory at the very end of her life when she debated whether or not to go on camera and tell the world, in her own words, that she had ALS. It was a brave decision. It was a tough decision. But nobody was going to tell her story better than she, and no one was going to tell her story when she could, and so she did. Dawn Clark Netsch was not just another pretty face. She was, as far as I was concerned, a goddess.
Go straight to a new slide. So, we don't want to start again. So, Wendy, we did her proud.
We did her proud.
She would be proud to be watching over this event. I thank you all for being here and enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for hosting this wonderful event. I'm Julie Hamos. I'm the moderator tonight, and thank you all for coming. I'm only hoping we're going to have a very important conversation today, and a timely one. I'm only hoping we don't leave here depressed. We're going to leave here, as always, activated and ready to fight. So to my left is Erin Delaney. Erin is a professor of law at Northwestern University, Pritzker School of Law, with a courtesy appointment in the Department of Political Science, and she is currently serving as Associate Dean of Faculty and Research. Geof Stone has been a law professor at University of Chicago since 1973. He's currently an Edward Levy Distinguished Service Professor. He served as Dean of the law school from 1987 to 1994. And we're not going to go through a lot more bio because you have it all, but I just want to say one more thing about Geof. When we first called him and I said to him, I was really intrigued by your recent book. And he said, which one? So he has been the author of many books on constitutional law. And the one that caught my eye is the one that was called Sex and the Constitution, Sex, Religion, and Law from America's Origin to the 21st Century. So we knew that he was well-versed on some of the issues we're going to talk about tonight. What I'm also intrigued by both professors is that they both clerked for a United States Supreme Court Justice. So that makes them eminently ready and capable of talking about the issues tonight. We decided to forego with opening statements because we want to get right into the heart of the issues facing us. Before we do that, I also want to introduce my co-chair, Wendy Cohn, who was featured in this montage as one of the Dawn's longtime legislative assistants, whatever we call them. Now today we call them chief of staff. We probably didn't do that. But she was with Dawn all those many years. So with that, let's get into the heart of it, and let's cut to the chase and talk about Roe v. Wade, something we all want to really hear about and understand what's happening, what will happen, what could happen with Roe v. Wade. So the question I would like to ask, if the Supreme Court decides to take a case that involves abortion issues and abortion rights, because there's several going up on their way to the Supreme Court, what are the different approaches they could take, and what would it really mean for women of America? Erin, why don't you start?
Well, thank you. Wait a minute. Thank you. Thank you to IWIL. Thank you to Wendy, Julie, Anna, and Elaine for inviting me. It's wonderful. Again, thank you, Steve, for hosting. And I do want to say it's a great honor to participate as a Northwestern law professor. Dawn Clark Netsch clearly paved the way for me personally as a professor at the law school. So again, thank you all very much. You know, in some ways we should start with Geof, because Geof has stories of the time of Roe v. Wade. So it might be fun to get the history. So I'll say a few things first, and then maybe I'll come back in at the end. We use Roe v. Wade in popular discussion because it stands as this landmark case. But really the question is, what are they going to do with Casey versus Planned Parenthood, which is a later case that some people refer to as a super precedent because it upheld Roe. Now, it didn't really upheld Roe in the way that we understand Roe to mean as a constitutional scholar, or what it might have meant on the ground to women. But it did uphold some of the idea of an ability to access an abortion. And so one question as a legal matter is, what is the test Casey presented, and how much of a barrier will that be to actually overturning Roe? Will the court have to do a lot more doctrinal work to make it happen?
What does that mean?
So in Casey said that the court is unwilling to overturn previous precedents unless certain factors are met, a test of stare decisis, or the idea that you stick with what you've previously said. And they identified a few factors. Workability of the doctrine was one factor, reliance. Has society relied on the Roe v. Wade decision? In Casey, they determined that it had. Changed facts and circumstances on the ground. So any new case that comes up that would want to overturn completely would have to confront that set of questions and what is different now from the time of Casey. It's perfectly plausible that a 5-member majority of the court could come up with that test. It's much easier to imagine an ongoing, slow trickle of cutting back here and there and continuing a process that has already begun to narrow the right as we may have understood it. Casey is part of that narrowing process itself, and later cases all go in the same direction. What is an undue burden on a woman's right to access an abortion? Well, even in Casey, a waiting period was not seen to be undue. Having to notify certain persons with a judicial bypass, not undue. So already kind of the layers that can be put upon your right to access have been upheld by the court.
So,
Turn on your mic.
I think it is on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as Erin said, I was a law clerk to Justice Brennan in the year that Roe v. Wade was decided. So I will take advantage of that inside baseball and share a bit of what it was like inside the court and dynamics among the justices at that time. So first, a bit of background to remind you is that several states began to liberalize their abortion laws in the late 1960s and around 1970. 4 states legalized abortion at that time. But the pushback politically, particularly among Catholics, was extremely strong, and there was essentially a complete halt in the legislative movement to liberalize abortion laws. And Roe v. Wade came to the Supreme Court. It was already in the process of becoming the Burger Court. And when they first heard argument in the case in 1971-72, the year before I was there were only 7 justices who could participate because Justices Powell and Rehnquist were not confirmed before Roe v. Wade was first argued. And the justices voted 6-1 to strike down the Texas statute, which was at issue, and to hold it unconstitutional. And Justice Blackmun was assigned to write the opinion by the Chief Justice Berger. And Blackmun decided to write a very narrow opinion. And so the argument that they were going to rely upon was that the Texas statute, like most statutes at the time, allowed abortion if it was necessary to protect the life or health of the woman. And Blackmun was going to write an opinion that said that necessary is ambiguous, and that for doctors to be put in a position where they might not be sure that their judgment about what was necessary would be the same as a criminal prosecution, that the law was unconstitutionally vague, and therefore Texas had to specify with a greater degree of detail what it meant to be necessary. This was an approach that the more liberal justices on the court, who were there from the Warren Court, like Justice Brennan, Justice Douglas, Thurgood Marshall, were not happy about. But this is as far as Blackmun and Berger and the others were willing to go. And so Blackmun spent most of that year trying to write an opinion that would essentially do nothing for all practical purposes. And by the end of the year, Blackmun was persuaded by some of the other justices that this wasn't really a satisfactory resolution of the issue. And so he went to the other justices at the end of the term and said, I think we should rehear the case the following year. That way, Justice Rehnquist and Justice Powell, who had been appointed but had not been on the court when Roe was first argued, would be able to participate, and it'll give us a better sense of how to deal with the issue. And so they decided not to resolve it in that year and to hear the case again the following term. That summer, Justice Blackmun, who used to be the general counsel for the Mayo Clinic, went back home to Minnesota, where he was from, and spent the summer doing research about 2 issues. One was the history of abortion throughout Western society, and second was what the world was like in a world of illegal abortion for women. And although people had begun telling their stories about that in the late 1960s, it was still not widely understood or appreciated. And so Blackmun came back the following fall with a much stronger sense of the need to address this question. And what Blackmun did was to explain to his colleagues on the court these two critical factors. First, what he explained was that abortion had been legal in Western society from the ancient world until the late 19th century. And that women in the Middle Ages, women in Greece and Rome, women at the time of the founding of the United States, at the time the Constitution was adopted, through the Civil War, could legally have abortions. And that abortions were widely advertised in the media and were not seen as terribly controversial. And that changed in the late 19th century when, during the social Puritan movement, an effort was made to criminalize abortion for the first time, and which was extraordinarily successful. So the first thing Blackmun did is go back and said, we've all assumed that abortion was always criminal, and that we're now being asked to legalize something that was illegal from the time immemorial. And what he was able to demonstrate to the other justices was that that simply was completely false, and that the criminality of abortion was a modern phenomenon, and that that history had been suppressed intentionally. The second thing he did was to begin to show the other justices the reality of life in a world in which abortion was illegal. The story of knitting needles and intentionally falling down flights of stairs and finding illegal abortionists by going to elevator operators and taxi cab drivers and having them recommend somebody and being told to show up on a street corner at 1 in the morning, have someone come up behind you, put a blindfold on you, push you in the back seat of a car, take you to some unknown place, and have people you never saw and didn't know perform a medical procedure on you, and then drop you back off again at 4 in the morning. And the 200 women a year died from illegal abortions, and many thousands more had serious consequences, all of which was secret, because abortion was illegal, and it was shameful, and women would not tell the story. And Blackmun brought to the other justices the reality of what this world was like. And that led the court, by a 7-2 vote, including 3 of the 4 justices appointed by Richard Nixon, to vote to do what the court did in Roe versus Wade, to take an extraordinarily bold position about the illegality of abortion. And one of the things that's been interesting is that there are people, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who have criticized the court for going as far as they did, as fast as they did in Roe v. Wade, and saying that had the court been more cautious and were more incremental and addressed the question over the period of 10 or 20 years, we would not have seen the pushback politically that occurred. And what I can tell you, having been there, is that the justices thought about this issue. And one of the things they came to was the judgment that we have now come to the view that to live in a world of illegal abortion is immoral, it's unacceptable, and it's completely contrary to fundamental constitutional values. And for us to insist on that world continuing for another 10, 20 years while we play it safe and take our time, while 1 million women a year are getting illegal abortions, is unconscionable. And the justices, including people like Lewis Powell and Harry Blackmun and Warren Burger, came to the judgment that this was not a world that could be reconciled with the values of our Constitution, and that Roe v. Wade had to be decided in the way it was decided. And the interesting thing about it that many people have forgotten is that when Roe v. Wade was decided, it was generally popular. There was very little criticism. Media, both in the North and even in the Southern and conservative states, basically regarded it as a sound and an appropriate decision. And it wasn't until the end of the decade when the moral majority came into being, triggered in part by opposition to abortion, but also by opposition to the ever greater availability of pornography, beginning of gay rights, the proposal of the Equal Rights Amendment, the women's movement, that the pushback against Roe and against all of these other movements came into effect. But the key point about Roe v. Wade that people forget is that it brought the world back to the world of the framers. It gave women the same rights they had when our Constitution was adopted. And that the reason for getting rid of that world was entirely founded in religious doctrine. And in a society dedicated to the separation of church and state, it is intolerable that religious belief should deny women freedom to control their own lives in the way in which Roe v. Wade guaranteed. So that's an important part of this that needs to be known, and people who are out there engaged in politics and engaged in explaining these issues to the public have to know this story and have to be able to convey it, because it changes fundamentally how people think about this decision.
Sort of recapturing Roe, because that's not the world we live in, right? We live in the Casey world, where not only is it not as aspirational and positive and hopeful, but when you say the Supreme Court what it means for women, well, what women are we talking about? There's one abortion clinic in Mississippi. If you are low income, if you are a woman of color, you have no access to abortion in much of the country. So it becomes, to me, I worry about an over-focus on I believe it's very important to have the right articulated by the court, perhaps the original right in Roe rather than the watered-down right, but it's also a lack of accessibility. It isn't really available, it isn't really a right. And so there's a concern, I think, about, again, even perhaps over-focusing on the court and missing out about what people need to do on the ground.
So if I can also say a few words about that. On the question of overruling Casey and Roe, I don't have any doubt that if the current 5 conservative justices remain on the court for another 5 to 7 years, they will overrule Roe v. Wade. I am confident of that myself. None of those 5 justices regards Roe v. Wade as legitimate in any way, frankly. And they and some of their predecessors have made very clear that they are perfectly willing to disregard the principle of precedent when they feel strongly about an issue. So 2 dramatic examples of that. One involved the issue of Citizens United. 7 years before Citizens United.
We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that.
But I want to say this about Roe. I'm sorry. I know you want to get to other issues, but I think this is really central to what we're here to talk about. 7 years before Citizens United, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, adopted an understanding of the First Amendment completely incompatible with what the court did in Citizens United. And thereafter, Justice O'Connor, who was in the majority, stepped down and was replaced by Justice Alito. And in a 5-4 decision, with Justice Alito having replaced Justice O'Connor and nothing else of consequence changing, they overruled the prior decision and decided Citizens United and completely transformed First Amendment law and the campaign finance reality of our world today. No regard for precedent whatsoever. And the second example involves abortion and the issue of partial birth abortion, where the Supreme Court, when it first heard the case on the question of the constitutionality of laws prohibiting partial birth abortion, ruled 5-4 that those statutes were unconstitutional and that women had a constitutional right to use partial birth abortion if it was necessary to preserve the health and life of the woman. And after Alito replaced O'Connor, who had been in the majority in the earlier decision, the 5 conservative justices voted to overrule the prior decision and held that the state can constitutionally prohibit partial birth abortion. So I don't believe these justices have any regard for precedent when they feel strongly about the merits of a particular case. And the only thing I think that will keep them from overruling Roe v. Wade before 5 or 7 years is Justice Roberts' desire to avoid so wildly overly politicizing the court that it damages him and the court in his reputation. But I think this is going to be, as long as those 5 justices remain on the court, I think this is where we're going to be. And in that sense, I think the critical question then goes back to the states. Because the issue then becomes, what will the states do to allow abortion and to grant women the freedom to have those abortions, not as a constitutional right under federal law, but as a matter of policy under state law? And the answer to that is going to be fairly simple. The blue states will basically allow abortion more or less the way it's allowed today in those states, and the red states will basically prohibit it.
So do you see the possibility of potentially the most draconian action, which is to outlaw abortion in every state. Is that a possibility?
To do that, the justices would have to say that a fetus is a person within the meaning of the 14th Amendment. And in the same way that if a state passed a law saying that if you have a child under the age of 2 and you decide you don't really want the kid, you can kill it. Presumably the Supreme Court would say that law is unconstitutional. That violates the rights of that child. And the state cannot authorize parents to murder their young children. If the Supreme Court were to hold that a fetus is a person, then that would be the same principle. Do I think they will do that? I think they believe that. I mean, in their own personal beliefs. Not as a constitutional matter, but as a personal matter. Would they hold that? Probably not. At least not in the short term.
I was going to say, I don't know what their personal beliefs would be on that, but that would be an enormous swing in another, sort of in an opposite direction, and also complicated by the normal approaches to constitutional interpretation, history, text, everything else. It's a heavy lift to move from fetus to person. You can do it. I mean, you can do it. It's possible.
Roe v. Wade was a heavy lift.
Yeah, but he was very careful in that to point out that a fetus was not a person.
No, my point is that the Roe v. Wade in itself was a completely revolutionary decision that was not easily reconciled with prior precedents.
So we can have that happen.
So let me ask this question. The really interesting part of your story was black men going home and doing all this outside research, right? So first of all, are justices allowed to do that? That's a side question. But my question is this: what if the Supreme Court decides to take the case that would somehow deal with Roe, and this was the seminal case, and the women and men revolted, and there was every day massive outpouring in the streets, all the way to the time it was being heard, to the time it was decided. Would that kind of public input and public opinion make an impact on the justices?
I think it would. Geof is not as optimistic.
Why do you think? Erin?
Well, I mean, the reverse side,
there's outside influences that.
Sure, but I mean, but it can't just start after the case comes up. It has to start now. I mean, the happy story, maybe happy isn't the right word, but a positive story of Geof's story about what happened after Roe v. Wade is the incredible effect that social movements have. Social movements have real effect on the court. For Justice Ginsburg to say, and she says it often, maybe we shouldn't have done that. For the idea of the social movement on the right against Roe and the success it has had both in putting people on the court and the role of the Federalist Society, and in encouraging moderates on the court to cut back. And Justice O'Connor herself, allowed the undue burden standard to be quite a burden to some women, particularly women with insufficient means. So it was wildly successful. So the idea that a social movement couldn't be successful in the other direction seems depressing. Now, it has to get organized and be effective, and that may be, ambitious. But I don't think it would mean nothing. And I do think 5 to 7 years, I would say longer. I think Chief Justice Roberts is very concerned about the integrity and institutional legitimacy of his court. His speeches in the past few weeks and things that he said strike me that is foremost in his mind as his own personal legacy as the Roberts Court.
So I agree that social movements have a real impact on the court. The Supreme Court would never have gotten around to deciding cases like Obergefell if there hadn't been a raising of consciousness about gay rights and so on. And I do think that a major national movement about abortion would have an effect on the court. In terms of Roberts, I'm less optimistic. I think Roberts is aware of the fact that somebody can drop dead any time. And if there's a Democratic president, now you go fight for it the other way.
Theoretically.
Theoretically, yes. Theoretically. Harlan, right, yes. But, I think that he recognizes the fact that if you don't do it while you have the opportunity, you may not get the opportunity. And I think you're right, for the next couple of years, given what's happened with Kavanaugh and so on, that he'll be cautious. But, memories are short. And I'd be surprised if he's worrying about that 5 years from now.
Kenji Yoshino is a professor at NYU, and he recently came and was speaking in Chicago, and he raised something about the nature of the social movement, the abortion-based right to abortion social movement, and he distinguished it from some other movements because he said, well, wealthy white women can access abortions. So the movement is not supported as in a way that it needs to be by a slice of the population. And the successful movements, he was comparing it to the Me Too movement. And he said, oh, but Me Too has this ubiquity for all women. And there isn't a group that is isolated or that somehow can opt out of having experienced Me Too. But because of access to wealth and access to abortion is differential for different groups of women, he was suggesting, and based on a program that he had done, I think with Justice Ginsburg, that might be harming the movement in important ways.
And one of the manifestations of that, it's a really important point, is that, first of all, wealthy women have access to very good contraception, so they rarely have unwanted pregnancies. And when they do, they can get an abortion. That's what happens. And the vast majority of abortions that take place today in the United States are from poor women. And if we care about abortion and the right of women as much as we say we do, then in those states that are effectively making abortion unavailable to those poor women, why aren't we paying for them to go to states where they can have abortions?
In the UK, when Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is just working to liberalize abortion this year, for years it was a UK-based charity that raised money and paid for women to take the boat over and access safe and legal abortions in the UK.
So let's move on to another issue, because women care about lots of issues that are potentially before the Supreme Court. There are also issues related potentially to birth control or to marriage equality. Do you think that those are threatened at all in the climate that we're in?
Birth control, no. Not at all. Marriage equality, probably not. I think that none of the 5 justices who now make up the majority of the court did vote for or would vote for Obergefell and the right to marriage equality. But the difference between marriage equality and abortion is profound. There are very large segments of the American people who believe that abortion is murdering a fetus, a person. And the passion that they feel on this issue is understandable if you accept that they really believe that this is murdering a person. The opposition to gay marriage is really remarkably timid and slight. And I don't think that the court sees it's worth it for them to use any of their chips to overrule Obergefell. Most states wouldn't change the law anyway, and not that many people care that much about it at this point.
What you probably will see is an end to any expansion of rights for many groups, but including on the basis of sexual orientation. And now we know what's happening with the Trump administration regarding transgendered persons. So.
One of the things Justice Kennedy did in writing Obergefell, which I thought was very unfortunate, was he grounded the decision in marriage, and that marriage is a fundamental right, instead of grounding it in the unacceptability of discrimination against people based on sexual orientation. And the difference is, Obergefell is about marriage. And there is no precedent that really addresses the question of discrimination against gays and lesbians or transgender persons. And I agree that this court is not going to go there. And they're going to leave states with broad freedom to continue to discriminate and to allow discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in ways that are just deeply unfortunate.
So, to a different issue, Illinois finally this year passed the Equal Rights Amendment after so many years. What do you think is the legal effect of this? I mean, understanding that the deadlines had passed a long time ago. And if by some magic the deadlines were extended and it became an amendment to the Constitution, would it in fact guarantee a right of create a right to abortion, as many of the opponents say?
Would you want to tell your story?
Okay, so it's the first long story.
I don't know. Oh, well,
It's a good story.
It's up to you. It's up to you. People like stories.
So, to go back to the beginning of this, when the Equal Rights Amendment was...
It's good to have old people on panel.
And old people in the audience. When the Equal Rights Amendment was first adopted by Congress, it was widely supported, and even President Nixon endorsed it. And everyone assumed it would be ratified very quickly, and that it was not controversial. So this story is, again, an inside baseball story about the Supreme Court. So the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment says no state shall deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. And the question is, what does that mean? Well, it can't mean literally what it says, because every law distinguishes among people. You have to graduate law school to be a lawyer. You have to be a certain age to get the driver's license. Every law distinguishes among people. So it clearly doesn't mean what it says. So it was initially adopted after the Civil War, and the basic understanding is that it was primarily about the rights of African Americans. Now, it could have said, no state shall deny to any African American the equal protection of the laws, but it didn't say that. And therefore, it clearly had a meaning that goes beyond only protecting the rights of African Americans. So one of the questions the court has always sort of had to deal with is, well, what else does it mean? To whom else does it apply and in what way? So for a long time, the court basically took the view that the Equal Protection Clause protected African Americans from discrimination unless the state had a very strong justification. But it basically was not applicable to anything else. And as long as the state had a rational reason for distinguishing among people, you had to go to law school to be a lawyer, you had to be a certain age to drive a car, whatever, as long as that was rational, that was consistent with the Equal Protection Clause. And applying that standard, the Supreme Court consistently upheld the laws that discriminated against women. Laws that said that women can't be bartenders, or women can't be lawyers, or women can't be on juries, or whatever. It's rational, women's places in the home, they don't have the same experience as men, it's constitutional.
Really, bartenders?
Yeah, literally. Yeah. So in 1970, for the first time, the Supreme Court held a law unconstitutional on the ground that it discriminated against women. And this was a law that was about who gets to be the executor of an estate when the deceased hasn't named an executor. And the state had a law that basically said the state will determine who gets to be the executor, and it tried to mimic basically what most people did when they did name executors. So, for example, if there were adult children, then an adult child would be appointed the executor. But if there was a son and a daughter, preference would be given to the male. And if there were no children, but there were siblings, then the brother would be referred to the sister. And the reason for this was because that's what most people did when they chose executors. They actually did prefer the man over the woman, partly because men had more business experience in general at that time than women, and so this was a, quote, logical thing to do. So it was a perfectly rational statute by those standards. Nonetheless, the court struck it down and held that it was irrational. It was a completely irrational decision in treating it as irrational, but it was remarkable. So 2 years later, when I was a law clerk to Justice Brennan, the court had a case called Frontier versus Richardson, which was another case involving discrimination against women. I won't go through the facts, but similar problem. And the court, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued the case before the Supreme Court, and the justices voted to strike down the statute on the basis of the earlier case, Reed versus Reed, saying the statute was irrational. And Justice Brennan was assigned the writing of the opinion. And I was the law clerk up in our chambers who was going to work on the case. So Brennan came back and said, okay, write the opinion, striking down the statute, saying the law is irrational on the basis of Reed v. Reed. So I went back and spent a couple of weeks writing this opinion, and I was very dissatisfied because it was completely intellectually dishonest. So I decided on my own to write an alternative opinion, which said that the statute, the laws that discriminate against women are analogous to laws that discriminate against African Americans. And that therefore, laws that discriminate against women should be tested not by the standard of rationality, by the standards that there needs to be a compelling government interest to justify it. And this is what Ruth Ginsburg had written in her brief. So I was basically lifting off of this brief. And with some anxiety, I left the two opinions on Brennan's desk late one night with a cover note saying, the first one is the one you asked me to write, and the second one is the one I decided to present to you because I really think the first one is intellectually dishonest. And I came in the next morning with some trepidation. And Brennan used to get there at 6, so we'd get there about 8. And when I got there, I discovered that Brennan had circulated both opinions to the other 8 justices with a note from him saying that the first one is the one I agreed to write in conference. But in my judgment, it is not intellectually honest. So I will personally sign the second one, and anyone who wants to join me is welcome to do so.
Good job.
And wait, story depends on how. So later that day, Justices Thurgood Marshall, William Douglas, and Byron Wright send notes to Brennan saying, join me in the second opinion. So we have 4 votes. And then the question was, could we get a 5th? And Justices Lewis Powell, Harry Blackmun, and Potter Stewart all independently went to Brennan and said, we're not going to join this opinion because the Equal Rights Amendment has just been adopted by Congress. It's before the states. We all know it's going to be ratified. For us to do this would be completely inappropriate for the court to essentially preempt the Equal Rights Amendment by saying the Equal Protection Clause does what the Equal Rights Amendment is inevitably going to do anyway. So we think it would be unwise and politically inappropriate for us to do this. And if the Equal Rights Amendment isn't adopted, which we know is not going to happen, but if it's not adopted, we can go back and do this later. And Brennan said to them, well, first of all, we have to interpret the Constitution as it exists today. But second of all, if the Equal Rights Amendment is not adopted, for the Supreme Court to then come back and say, oh, we don't care about that. We're going to interpret the Equal Protection Clause to mean what the Equal Rights Amendment would have meant had it been adopted, would be impossible. So if we don't do it now, we don't have the chance to do it later if the Equal Rights Amendment isn't adopted. Well, that did not persuade them. And the rest of them voted to say it was irrational and unconstitutional. They believed Brennan's opinion was right, but they, for reasons of expediency, didn't think it was wise to adopt it. So only the 4 justices joined that opinion. And of course, the Equal Rights Amendment was never adopted, and the Supreme Court never came around and did what we argued for in Frontiera. It's an interesting moment about how these dynamics work. And the irony of it is that if the Equal Rights Amendment had not been proposed, the Supreme Court would have adopted the Equal Rights Amendment under the Equal Protection Clause.
Wow. That's quite a story.
Yeah. Interesting.
So that brings us to today. Do we have a valid Equal Rights Amendment out there? What is the impact of this late action?
So if you get a 38th state, then there would be a question of whether or not the effort to impose a deadline itself is constitutional. So you'd have to first kind of go back and pick at, does Congress, in its constitutionally delegated power to sort of propose amendments in the first place, have the power to propose the mechanisms by which they are going to be, the time limit under which they're going to be ratified. And obviously the 27th Amendment didn't have one of those time limits, so there would be arguments on both sides. Would it matter if it were accepted? Sure, in some ways. It will be hard to figure out in all ways. I mean, my first experience, so here's my less exciting story, but my first experience meeting a Supreme Court justice was meeting Justice Scalia. I was a young PhD student, and I was at a special conference at the Supreme Court Historical Society for 3 weeks, and one day Justice Scalia came in and was talking to us, or about 12 of us, about women's rights at the Supreme Court. And he said, quite to the contrary of the justices that Geof was referencing, that it absolutely does not apply to women, the Equal Protection Clause. He thinks the entire portion of that case law was ridiculous. It was made up. There was no plausibility at all that anyone at the time of the writing of the 14th Amendment even remotely considered women to be equal. So he would need an ERA to even begin to feel comfortable with some of these. So that goes quite far from abortion. I mean, we're just talking about some of the more low-hanging bartending and jury service fruit on the tree. So at some point, it answers those calls of originalists and people who kind of perceive constitutional interpretation in a particular lens. It solves that problem. To get all the way to abortion is a more complicated story again, because that certainly isn't, equality norms haven't been driving our abortion jurisprudence. It's been privacy norms and the understanding of privacy, maybe bodily integrity, but different kinds of jurisprudential themes rather than the equality theme. So it would require a complete reconceptualization of how we have been thinking about abortion to put it into the ERA. So I think when people say, proponents of the ERA say, well, it doesn't ineluctably and quickly lead to abortion, I think that's right. I mean, there's work to be done to make that transfer.
Yeah, sometimes people criticize Roe v. Wade for not resting the decision on equality, but you now know why they couldn't do that. Because the story I told you about Frontiero, that was happening at the same time as Roe v. Wade, exactly the same time. And the court couldn't rely on equality rights of women to decide abortion because they weren't prepared to recognize equality rights for women at all, even with bartenders. So that's, again, inside baseball, that people don't realize that the court could not rely upon equality. But I agree with the notion that Erin puts forth, that it would be a stretch to go from the Equal Rights Amendment to a right of abortion. Not implausible, but it would be a stretch.
Since only women get pregnant and have abortions.
Do you want to talk about condoled egg?
Tell them, no tell them.
Okay.
It's too painful.
Well, basically, the court has said that laws that put restrictions on people who are pregnant does not discriminate against women, because it's just the condition of pregnancy. And it's not all women, it's just the fact of pregnancy, and that's not the same thing as discriminating against women. And given that perverse logic, you would say the same thing about abortion. Yeah.
Right, so let's talk about a few other issues. So consumer rights could also be impacted in this new world that we're in. You know, in 2011, Justice Scalia pretty much curtailed consumer class actions, and now mandatory arbitration is pretty much written into almost anything, so access to civil lawsuits has been really curtailed. There are cases challenging the role of the Financial Protection Consumer Bureau that are on their way to the Supreme Court. So what are the prospects, you think, for consumers and unions with this new court?
Poor. I mean, it's not good news. I think that is something that was already clear with cases like Janus. A lot of attention to that case in Illinois, and the AT&T case in 2011. That's the arbitration case, the case about overturning a California Supreme Court's effort to say that preventing people from class-wide arbitration in contracts was unconscionable, particularly in contracts of adhesion, like in your credit card contract. And the Supreme Court said no, that was fine under the Federal Arbitration Act, that the Federal Arbitration Act preempted California's efforts to protect consumers. So things do not look bright. I'm not sure I have any positive. Do you have any?
No, I think that's right.
I mean, unions is also
business orientation with the board.
Yes.
Yeah. So another issue that I think I'm mystified by is as we know, Citizens United, what impact it has had on vast amounts of money being poured into races. We see it this time around more than ever, and under the guise of First Amendment. And yet, it seems like every day in my mailbox, I get emails from various groups that are saying, end Citizens United. So how do we end Citizens United, actually?
Pray.
I mean, what could be a strategy to overturn that or deal with it somehow?
So there's two ways to overturn it. One of them is to have the Supreme Court do it. And Merrick Garland been confirmed to the Supreme Court, as he should have been. Over time, Citizens United would have been undermined, and as it should have been. And that's one of the many reasons why they would not confirm Merrick Garland. But one way to do it is to have a Supreme Court that's prepared to cut back on it and eventually overrule it over a period of years. But that requires a different court than the one we have now. And the only way we get that is by electing a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate. And hope somebody dies. You need all three things, unfortunately.
yeah, we can.
Well, you can increase the size of the court.
That's
different. That's a nicer way of doing it.
So
Also
talk about that
potentially
for a minute.
problematic. Do you want to talk about
Talk about
court
increasing the size of the court. What's that strategy about?
I don't like that.
Me neither.
My view is that the Supreme Court has credibility in our system. If we can believe that the justices are applying the law as lawyers try to do in a not result-oriented manner, and if they don't do that, then we shouldn't have a Supreme Court because it's not doing what it's supposed to do. And I think what we now have is a court which is radical in the sense that there are 5 Republican-appointed justices who will vote the way the Republican Party wants them to vote, not because of that, because they share their views. In virtually every highly controversial and important case that comes before the court, and 4 justices appointed by Democratic presidents who will vote more or less the way liberals and Democrats want them to vote in these most important ideological controversial cases. That's not a court, frankly. And that's never existed in this country in this way. And it's pretty disastrous. And it's the consequence of Merrick Garland not being confirmed. And it's the consequence of the effort on the part of the Federal Society and conservatives to appoint ever more rock-hard conservatives to the court. You know, Anthony Kennedy and Sandra Day O'Connor and David Souter and Lewis Powell and Harry Blackmun and Warren Burger, they weren't good enough, right? It had to be further and further and further to the right. And this gives me, I mean, I find this really deeply frustrating and depressing. But adding more justices, if the Democrats manage to control the Senate and the House and the White House to do that, is only exacerbating it. So, you know, what I think needs to happen, and I don't believe this is likely, but what needs to happen if there were adults in the government, if there were adults in the government, is Democrats and Republicans get together and say, okay, we need to save our nation, and we need to save our judiciary. And one way to do that is to make an agreement that starting 6 years from now, so we don't know who's going to be controlling what, right? No justice will be confirmed to the Supreme Court unless a majority of the Republicans and Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee are prepared to support that nominee. And to just grow up. But, you know, the odds on that happening are fairly remote.
We were talking just before about how the United States is unusual in not having a supermajority requirement for appointment to the court. Many other systems have that. I mean, to the other way of changing Citizens United, right, the second way is a constitutional amendment. And one thing I think that's interesting about that is getting Congress to get the ball rolling with a constitutional amendment. Maybe there would have been an ability to do that under Obama in the small slice of time where there was a Democratic Congress. But it's interesting that nothing happened right away, right after Citizens United.
So remind us how that works.
So you need 2/3 of the House and the Senate plus 3/4 of the states to have a constitutional amendment. So now there are other ways you can have a constitutional convention, but this is the normal process that we've been using the past couple of hundred years. And but you need the House and the Senate to vote. Now I don't know if it would have worked at the time right after Citizens United happened, but what's interesting, or a question that I would throw out to the group is, does Citizens United help both parties as parties? Is money coming in from a lot of different places to the party apparatuses? And so who has the incentive to get that constitutional amendment off the ground? So when grassroots voters and people are saying, oh, I'm frustrated with this, I don't like this, that might not be the same people. And so it may be just a left-right issue, or it may be sort of an elite grassroots kind of issue that slices and dices the population in different ways. And so I think money and politics gets very complicated as we start thinking more precisely about where is the money coming in. And once you win, you've won based on all of this money, do you then want to give up that advantage you've just gotten? It's very, very tricky. You see these things also in gerrymandering. Right? Do we go to some sort of neutral approach, or does the other side just gerrymander back?
Right. I think that's a really good point about Citizens United. I think that both Democrats and Republicans are putting in vast amounts of money, the unions and businesses putting in vast amounts of money, so it's pretty much a fair game. It's just the rest of us who are so offended by all this money in politics. So I think we wanted to open it up now and see what kind of questions you have. I have a few more, but I think we want to hear what's on your mind. Questions? Yes, please.
I have many questions, but I'm not.
Okay, we're going to ask you, talk into the microphone.
So I think a lot of the discussion around Roe v. Wade is about access to abortion. But if we're to take this issue seriously, why are there not more people fighting for access to comprehensive sexual health education to prevent unintended pregnancies? And a part of it, I think, is also because sexual health education can empower young people to understand when they've been abused or harassed. And I think like maybe it's a means to keep people silent. So why do you think there's not more movement in that direction?
That's a great and important observation. There are now a little over 800,000 abortions in the United States. Women from the middle and upper classes have almost none because of access to contraception and knowledge about birth control. If all women in the United States had the same knowledge and access, the number of abortions in the United States would be about 60,000. If you simply take the percentage of abortion among people in the middle class and above and you apply that to the nation, you wind up with about 60,000 abortions a year instead of 800,000. And that's about simply education and access to contraception. And it's absolutely tragic that we are not doing that. I mean, that's not that hard to do, frankly. And we're just not doing it.
Well, I will say, first of all, the CEO of Illinois Planned Parenthood is here, Jennifer Welch, and I'm on the board. And I will say that we are trying that. It's not as sexy of an issue as a public campaign. I will also say that what it has made a huge difference is that with Medicaid expansion, especially here in Illinois, again, not true to all the states, but certainly here in Illinois, a lot of the low-income young women who did not have access to Medicaid-funded contraception and family planning services now do, and they're able to get under Medicaid any approved FDA device. So there's a big effort, and it's been very successful to get more and more women to really take advantage of what is actually now a new health insurance law that we have, relatively new. But again, I mean, your question is not a legal question, but it's more of a political campaign question. And I think it's exactly right. Prevention is really important.
It's also a federalism question at some level, right? Because what we're hearing about is what is the national response to a problem, and where does that bump up against to control over states, right? Dawn Clark Netsch would want to be talking about state and local government law, right? And at some level, right, you start thinking about education and who controls education and how you solve that in some easy national fix is impossible. It requires a level of organization that's extremely taxing, and it requires us to say in one state that we are going to go and try to organize in another state, rather than try to just go to the national level and get the problem solved for everyone. So another function of the Supreme Court's being in the hot seat is an ongoing approach because of the inability to change states and really Jim Crow, coming out of the Jim Crow era, going to the national level to get the solutions from the courts. But that may not be available anymore, and it might be incumbent on organizations to be thinking to state activism.
And part of what I'm saying is it does not have to be government action.
Right.
This could be private organizational action to educate and provide these resources, and that's what should be done.
And I think the comprehensive sex education issue is being played out in many ways like abortion. So in a wonderful blue state like ours, we do have a law requiring comprehensive sex education in the schools. In many of the same states that are putting all these restrictions on the right to abortion also have an abstinence-only education requirement. So it gets played out politically the same way. Unfortunately, it's the women in the other states who have it way worse off than we do here. And yes, questions?
So I want to go back a little bit to stand up.
Give me a microphone.
Yeah, we thought, and looking at
So you mentioned really briefly the idea of a constitutional convention, and several states have actually already approved the idea of that. There's people on the right pushing for one.
That's
and then,
scary.
yeah, and then people on the left pushing for one to overturn Citizens United, and on the left people are saying, oh, don't worry, it won't be a runaway convention, and then there are lots of lawyers saying, oh, what do you mean, don't worry? So I'd love to have your view on it so I can go back and respond to people who are saying, don't worry.
So my other hat is a comparative constitutional scholar, and I can't think of a single convention ever that has not been a runaway convention, period, including our own, right, including our own. So I think that that the idea that you can limit something like that when the pouvoir constituant comes together and starts rethinking the government under which they're going to exist, you cannot limit that. So it's scary.
I agree with that.
Aren't there several states that already have pushed for this?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, scary. Yes.
Can't let you get away without asking what your impressions were of the Kavanaugh hearings and what you thought about his judicial demeanor during that fateful afternoon.
I thought it was a high point of American history. Kavanaugh his reputation is as a smart judge, not particularly different from Alito or Gorsuch, which is not what I admire, but capable judge. But his behavior in the face of the accusation, I thought was completely disqualified in terms of temperament, judgment, everything. I mean, this is not somebody I'd want to know, let alone have be a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. I thought it was disgusting.
It was a deeply distressing period, I think, for the country. There's a lot of political science on how people view the court and how they view the justices and how the court gets its legitimacy. And it's really interesting work. And one thing that came out actually of the Alito hearings and the Alito confirmation process was an interesting paper by two leading political scientists who do all this work, named Gibson and Caldera. And they wrote this article saying that when you already are enthusiastic about the court, or you think the court is an important aspect in American life, it's something that you value, you are more likely to view judiciousness as the touchstone in confirmation hearings. And this, they kind of ran a lot of, political sciencey numbers and things like that. And so it becomes a trade-off between judiciousness and partisanship. Even though most Americans realize, even though they say, according to the political science, that judges aren't politicians in robes, almost the same portion say, but we know that their personal background and personal understandings influence their decisions. So there's something in between there. But that being said, if you kind of believed in the court initially, then judiciousness is your touchstone as you evaluate the experiences rather than partisanship. And I think that is why the comments that he made that seemed to so many to be so injudicious really gathered a much broader group of people together, signing a professor's letter, and sort of being more negative at that moment than even just the aspect of the content of the claims. A kind of a wider group came together, and that is totally in line with how we understand judicial appointments and what the political science would have said. And that's why I think it is so distressing, right? That judiciousness actually, it does actually matter tremendously.
As a PhD in political science, did you really call it political sciencey numbers?
I did, because I don't like regressions either.
Yes.
I was just going to comment that may be the reason that Justice Roberts just gave two speeches talking about how it's important that the court, just recently in the past 2 days, he made two major statements on how the court has to be judicial and nonpartisan, and he sees his reputation sort of floating off.
Yes.
One of the issues that's really relevant in Chicago is gun safety legislation, and in particular, this has all the dimensions of being a state versus federal kind of a conflict. What is the role of the Supreme Court in figuring out, is there a way to curtail the Second Amendment advocacy groups and to set very specific kind of perimeters and framework on what the Second Amendment actually means in the space where our technology is so much more advanced than what the framers had in mind?
Heller was, remember, a 5-4 decision, and I'm going to step back and say a little bit about constitutional interpretation here. Okay, so if you ask about how liberal justices tend to approach the task of constitutional interpretation in those cases in which there are no direct precedents and there's ambiguity about what the law should be, what they tend to do to a very high degree in those 3 or 4 cases every term where it's highly uncertain and it's potentially ideological, cases involving things like abortion or search and seizure or affirmative action and so on, is they tend to follow an approach to constitutional interpretation that is consistent, in my view, with why we have judicial review. And that is designed to be a check on majoritarian abuse. That is, the danger of democracy is particularly twofold. One is that majorities will disadvantage minority groups who are not fully represented in the process and who are seen as the other. And democracy will not protect against that abuse, and you need courts to do that. And the second is the danger that those in positions of power, if they have the opportunity, will pass laws designed to perpetuate their power. And there again, you need courts to step in and be able to determine whether those are legitimate or illegitimate actions. Those are the two most important reasons for having a judiciary and judicial review. And if you look at the actions of what we call liberal justices over time, going from, let's say, the beginning of the Warren Court to the present, those justices vote to invalidate laws that raise those two issues, and basically beyond that are pretty deferential, including, for example, guns. Guns do not raise that issue. Let the majority decide what it wants to do unless something is completely off the charts, right? But on issues like women's rights, gay rights, minority rights, the rights of criminal defendants, that's where courts need to step in and protect those individuals. Or laws that are designed to manipulate the political process, like gerrymandering and denying the right to vote to people, courts need to step in because the abuses are real and they're serious. If you look at the voting behavior of justices on the current court who we think of as liberal, or justices over the past half century we thought of as liberal, they will correlate remarkably closely to those two situations. If you look at the conservative justices in that time period, what you'll find is they don't correlate to any principle or theory of constitutional interpretation. Quite honestly, I mean, I've done this is true, right? They do not adhere to anything like judicial restraint, which was once advocated as a conservative approach. They strike down as many laws as liberal justices do, frankly. They give no real credence to originalism unless it is consistent with their conservative desires. So Citizens United is completely inconsistent with originalism. Affirmative action being unconstitutional is completely inconsistent with originalism, and so on. What they do is vote in the way political conservatives would like to do. And they are restrained when that's convenient, and they're activist when it reaches those results. And that is, in fact, what leads those justices to vote the way they do. And they can dress it up any way they want to, but if you look at the results and you compare it to what political conservatives would like to see, you will find a remarkably high correlation. And that's dangerous because it's really incompatible with what the function of courts is supposed to be.
About the Second Amendment more specifically, no, it's a very strange right that the court has developed. It has shades, actually, ironically, of the abortion right, in that it isn't the way we think of a right as a trump, that you get your right. There are all sorts of odd exceptions. Justice Scalia's original opinion is filled with possible outs, because, well, what do we do with people who have mental health problems? What do we do with different kinds of guns? And there isn't a lot of richness and specificity because it gets difficult, even for those inclined to find this right. It's still difficult. And so, I think one of the things that I found, there was a case before the court right after, a couple days after a shooting in California a few years ago. And they denied cert. They said they didn't want to take it up, and there were dissents from denial by Justice Thomas saying, no, we should do this in a sort of admirably principled, unused to the world kind of way. This is a thing. We need to give more clarity. And it seemed perfectly obvious to me that they did not want to touch a complicated gun rights issue in the wake of another mass shooting for anything. And so there is a question about how the stomach that the new middle, I don't know who is that, Roberts and Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh as it is not in the law. But there is a question about the stomach, that they have for engaging in this at all. So once again, we may be back to the states, seeing what's happening in various states, and they may let this percolate for a while.
So I think we have time for just a couple more questions, yes.
Hi. Hi, Professor Delaney. This is my comma, Professor. So I've been thinking a lot about the legitimacy of the court, and it seems like a lot of the questions have been very grounded in us assuming a framework where we will have judges who might act in one way or the other, but they're still going to attempt to stick to some version of the law as they're moving forward. And with judges in the courts being the step in to kind of keep our democracy together, in 5, 7, or maybe even 5 or 7 years, will we truly have a legitimate Supreme Court? It just seems like our democracy is slowly eroding. And maybe it's because I'm a young person that it feels like everything is on fire and everything is going wrong. But did that question make sense?
It did. It made great sense. I think to say just a couple things about legitimacy, and we talk about the Supreme Court's legitimacy. What does that even mean, right? And you can break it down, and law professors like to break things down. There's the legal legitimacy. Will Professor Stone buy the legal arguments the Supreme Court is giving out? That really matters, but not for the average person on the street, right? There's sort of social legitimacy. Do I, as a person on the street, feel like these decisions matter to me? Do I support the court in that way? And that's kind of a different slice of legitimacy. And what the political scientists have shown there is that we are all biased, and we all fall into the cognitive bias of motivated reasoning. And so when they look out at how people perceive the court, if the people accept the results, they don't particularly care about the reasoning. If people don't accept the result, they understand the reasoning to be flawed. And by flawed, they mean politicized. And it doesn't matter how much information you give them, they tend to stick to these two frames. And so the question is, well, how do you operate in a world where that is the way legitimacy works? We are likely to see things as legitimate if we agree with them. Well, that's a world of contingent compliance. We comply because we believe the other side is going to comply. And that usually works and has worked because there are winners and losers, and it goes back and forth. When one group consistently loses, though, they stop believing in this idea of contingent compliance. They stop thinking, well, what will happen when the other side loses? Well, will they stick to the law? Do we always have to go along? And there's actually a group of people that regularly lost between the 1970s and 1980s, and it was African Americans, and the political scientists have shown that the credibility and the legitimacy of the court among that grouping plummeted because they felt like they were always on the losing end. So the question is, at some level, does the court understand this? Because if they don't, then we are in a problem, because the way it's shaping up right now with a 5-4 split and the nature of that split, there is going to be a losing side. Now again, to leave it on a positive note, many of the cases before the court every year are 8-0, or this year, 7-2 or 9-2, whatever it is. They're wildly plural, right? They fall on one side because they're not of significance in a major way as social cases. They are of huge significance to lawyers, clarifying the law, making things better, making sure people know what they're doing. And I think there's an assumption maybe by some that as long as you're doing a lot of those cases and you're clarifying the law and you're making things better in some ways, that it's okay if those 3 or 4 major cases keep coming out in one direction. That that's going to be the balance. But I don't think that's how people perceive it. I don't think that's going to work. So if that's the institutional calculation that the chief is making, that's probably not going to sustain him for much time after those 5 to 7 years. Do you?
Okay, well, so do we have time for another question?
One last question.
Somebody has a microphone.
Yeah. Hi, that's a lot of pressure. One last question. So my question comes out of some of these discussions we've been having. So the legitimacy of the court, depoliticizing the court, traditions around the court. Can you talk a little bit about the idea of lifetime judicial appointments for the Supreme Court in particular, and one, where the U.S. stands in terms of the norms for other countries, 2, if there's any actual movement toward a formal or an informal, going away from that. I know the Brennan Center has talked about this a little bit, like either an informal agreement, the way you were talking about with like that, this person will be appointed for X number of years so that it rotates and that presidents have sort of a certainty of appointments that rotates so that there's less, Merrick Garland of it all. If we could talk a little bit about that, that would be.
Thank you. Geof?
The main reason why the framers created life tenure for justices of the Supreme Court was to insulate them from concerns and motivations to what happens to them later, right? What jobs will be available to me next. And that was intentional, and the framers thought about this, and they chose to give life tenure to judges precisely to insulate them from the factors that might otherwise distort their reasoning.
Like becoming lobbyists?
Yes, like becoming lobbyists, or like becoming anything, And I think that worked. I think judges have behaved in that way because they have life tenure, and that's been successful. The question is, what would happen if you went to the most common formula is 18 years, because the theory is that every president gets 2 nominees over an 18-year period, each term. I would worry that if you have people who are appointed at the age of 40 and they're going to be done at 58, at a time when people are living longer and longer, that they are going to be subject to the kinds of concerns that the framers were worried about. On the other hand, I think the idea of having justices in their 80s is really not very sensible, frankly. And so I don't know what the right answer to this is. I don't feel strongly one way or the other about it. But I do worry that this notion that we can go to an 18-year term will have exactly the distorting effects that the framers were wise enough to avoid.
We are the only country in the world to have lifetime appointments with no retirement age. It is unusual.
Which is why we've had the best constitutional law.
So on that happy note, I thank you, Professor Geof Stone, Professor Erin Delaney. Let's give them a big applause. Real learning session. I think we were all listening intently. We've all learned a lot, and thank you so much, and thank all of you for your participatory democracy. And I think our call to action is that even the Supreme Court is not immune to public forces and public opinion and movements. So we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we can somewhat, as much as we can, hold them accountable too. So thank you all again for coming.